Forget the romanticized Hollywood version, top hats, tea parties, all that. Because the real Victorian London? It was a claustrophobic machine fueled by sweat, blood, and a total lack of personal space. In the 1870s, the British Empire was at its absolute peak. But on the ground level, the capital was a grinding, high-stakes survival game where your morning commute started at 2 a.m. and a single slip on a slick cobblestone could end your career. This wasn't just a city. It was a compressed ecosystem where every square inch of pavement was a battleground for trade, and every breath was a cocktail of damp straw, animal waste, and coal smoke. From the hidden sewers beneath the Victoria Embankment to the brutal hierarchies of the docklands, the 1870s were a time of extreme engineering meeting medieval misery. We're stripping away the cinematic filter to see how millions of people actually functioned in a world that rewarded speed, ignored exhaustion, and treated human labor as a disposable resource. This is the raw, unedited blueprint of the modern metropolis, where life was fast, the air was thick, and the rules of the street were written in grit and gaslight. Now imagine stepping out into a world where the sun hasn't risen, yet the city is already screaming at a volume that would shatter a modern eardrum. Victorian London didn't care about your sleep schedule or your sense of personal boundaries, because in the 1870s, if you weren't moving, you were an obstacle to be stepped over. We're diving deep into the literal guts of the world's most powerful city to reveal the visceral reality of a society that was inventing the future while still elbow-deep in the filth of the past. You'll see why the layout of a single junction could dictate your survival, and how the very air you breathed changed flavor from one neighborhood to the next. This isn't a history lesson. It's a sensory immersion into a landscape of constant motion, where the difference between a payday and starvation was often just a matter of knowing which diagonal path to take through a crowded market. Brace yourself, because the reality of the 1870s is far weirder, louder, and more dangerous than any textbook ever dared to admit. 1. Covent Garden. In 1870, this was not a trendy shopping destination. It was a brutal wholesale engine that ignited long before the first hint of dawn. While the rest of the world slept, thousands of carts from the countryside flooded the piazza between 4 and 6 a.m. to unload perishable goods. There were no designated sidewalks, no pedestrian zones, meaning you either kept pace with the high-speed flow of heavy crates, or you risked being crushed by a horse-drawn delivery. 2. And speed was the only currency that mattered here. The Victorian obsession with freshness meant that every minute of delay directly slashed the price of produce. Buyers for massive London hotels and elite restaurants didn't browse. They conducted lightning-fast inspections by touch and smell under the flickering glow of hissing gas lamps. If a porter hesitated for even a second to check a route, they effectively jammed the entire mechanism of trade, turning the street into a chaotic bottleneck. 3. The sounds of the 1870s market were a tactical language: shouts, price calls, rhythmic warnings, a primitive air traffic control system. Silence was actually a sign of failure, a breakdown in the supply chain. Noise meant goods were moving and money was changing hands. This cacophony wasn't random. It was a high-pressure communication network that allowed thousands of workers to navigate pitch-black, wet-stone surfaces without colliding in the dark. 4. Just a few blocks north, the wide-open flow of the piazza vanished into the notorious Seven Dials, a deliberate urban trap where 7 streets collided. Built in the late 17th century but reaching peak density by 1870, this junction was designed to slow traffic and force people to overlap in a confusing architectural tangle. The sightlines were so short you could only see a few dozen yards ahead, creating a permanent sense of disorientation for anyone unfamiliar with it. 5. By the 1870s, Seven Dials had become so overcrowded that the concept of home essentially dissolved. Private domestic life spilled out onto public doorsteps and corners. Lodging houses were subdivided into tiny, suffocating cells where multiple families shared a single room, forcing residents to cook, wash, and socialize on the pavement. The street wasn't just a path for travel. It was a living room, a workshop, and a nursery for thousands who had nowhere else to exist. 6. Surviving the compressed streets of Seven Dials required a specific physical intelligence. Locals learned to cross the junction diagonally, cutting precise angles to avoid the heavy congestion that stalled outsiders moving in straight lines. This wasn't just habit, it was a necessary survival skill. Getting trapped in a crowd meant losing hours of potential work or becoming a target for theft. 7. Moving east into Whitechapel and Spitalfields meant entering the most densely populated acre of land on the entire planet. By 1871, the housing crisis was so severe that some buildings held hundreds of people in a space meant for a single family, a vertical hive of humanity. Stairwells in these tenements never actually rested because workers on different shifts were constantly ascending and descending in a 24-hour cycle of movement and noise. 8. And here's the thing. That extreme proximity turned the streets of Whitechapel into a lethal breeding ground for the massive smallpox epidemic that ravaged London between 1871 and 1872. Health inspectors recorded entire rooms where the sick and the healthy shared the same stagnant air, yet the work never stopped. Poverty was more immediate than the fear of death. Families adjusted their daily routines around the dying, keeping their places in hiring queues even as the contagion spread through their own hallways. 9. The social fabric of 1870s. Whitechapel was a jarring mix of languages and cultures, Irish laborers, Jewish immigrants, dock workers, all forced into a fragile coexistence. Because private space was almost non-existent, the street became the only common ground where these disparate groups could exchange information about available work or looming dangers. People kept moving constantly to avoid being labeled idle by the police because standing still for too long was often treated as a criminal offense. 10. Smithfield Meat Market operated on a schedule that was even more unforgiving, swinging its doors open at 2 a.m. to process the city's massive daily protein requirement. Without modern refrigeration, the entire operation was a race against the rising sun and the inevitable heat that would spoil the carcasses. Every piece of meat had to be moved, sold, and transported across London before the morning rush of pedestrians and carriages clogged the main arteries. 11. The ground at Smithfield was a permanent hazard, covered in a slick, dark layer of blood, fat, and animal waste that was washed but never truly clean. Workers spread straw and sawdust for traction, but it was trampled into greasy sludge within minutes of opening. Porters carrying heavy carcasses overhead had to develop a specialized, wide-stanced walk to avoid slipping, because a single fall could mean a broken limb or a lethal infection. 12. And at Smithfield, human safety was simply secondary to the continuous flow of the supply chain. Injuries were routine inconveniences. If a man slipped or a load swung and caused a deep cut, the work didn't pause. The wound was bound with a rag, and the next porter stepped in. The police presence focused entirely on preventing congestion, effectively treating the human workers as just another component in the mechanical flow of goods. 13. St. Catherine's Docks served as the high-security gateway for the most valuable treasures of the British Empire: tea, spices, tobacco from across the globe. Unlike the open markets, these docks were enclosed by massive brick warehouses rising directly out of the Thames, creating a fortress-like environment. Everything here moved according to rigid vertical routines, with massive iron cranes swinging cargo from ship to shore in a constant synchronized rhythm of heavy metal and rope. 14. Labor at the London docks in 1870 was a brutal daily lottery. Hundreds of men gathered at the gates each morning hoping for a simple nod from a foreman. This call-on system meant your survival for the day was decided in seconds, based on your physical appearance or perceived strength. Those who weren't chosen didn't just go home. They spent the day drifting between other hiring points, hoping for a sudden surge in cargo that required extra hands. 15. The sensory landscape of the docks was defined by the heavy smells of wet rope, tar, and the raw residue of colonial goods: wool, sugar, all of it. Sound traveled differently here, because the open water of the Thames allowed the clinking of chains and the shouts of sailors to echo over long distances. It was a temporary world where sailors from every corner of the earth mixed briefly with local laborers before vanishing back into the river's fog. 16. The completion of the Victoria Embankment in 1870 marked the first time London used massive engineering to literally hide its own waste from public view. Before this, Sewage pooled in the streets or drained into shallow open channels, a permanent stench, a constant threat of cholera. By moving the waste into enclosed tunnels beneath the new roadway, the city engineered a surface-level calm that felt nothing short of revolutionary to the Victorian pedestrian used to filth. 17. But this new embankment was more than a road. It was a tool for behavioral control, forcing people to walk in straight, predictable lines for the first time. The wide promenade and regular spacing of gas lamps removed the pockets of chaos and trade that defined older parts of the city like Seven Dials. It was a sterile, measured environment where the river was managed by a stone wall, teaching Londoners that progress meant moving waste and disorder out of sight. 18. And while the embankment looked clean, it didn't actually solve London's pollution problem. It simply relocated it downstream, away from the wealthy eyes of the West End. The engineering miracle kept the surface dry and the air feeling lighter, but it also displaced the intense social pressure of the city further inland. This was the birth of the modern city's strategy: hide the essential but ugly systems underground and maintain a polite, orderly public facade. 19. As night fell in 1870, the pressure of the city shifted toward Leicester Square and Soho, transformed by the growing power of industrial gaslight. This district was specifically designed to pull foot traffic into a state of pause, using theaters and music halls to convert the day's fatigue into profit. The streets here fed the massive crowds gathering to see performances at the Alhambra Theatre, creating a whole new kind of nighttime congestion. 20. The 1870s saw a massive legal battle over the licensing of these music halls, because the sheer scale of the crowds began to terrify local authorities. It wasn't just a question of morality. It was about the physical danger of thousands of people lingering in a concentrated area with limited exits. When the Alhambra's license was eventually restored, it was essentially a confession that the public's demand for entertainment had become stronger than the government's ability to regulate it. 21. The crowd in 1870s Leicester Square was a volatile mix of off-duty soldiers, clerks, and visitors, all being tested by the local pickpockets. These thieves didn't just snatch purses. They looked for gaps in the rhythm of the crowd, using the flickering, flat gaslight to hide their movements. People negotiated prices at entrances and argued over space, while the police remained passive, watching for total breakdown rather than directing the flow. 22. And by the end of the evening, the system of Victorian leisure had drained the workers' pockets and released them back into the dark streets to start the cycle over. This wasn't a world of relaxation. It was a conversion of human pressure into consumption, where even fun was a high-intensity experience managed by the city's mechanics. The 1870s didn't just build the streets we walk today. They created the very systems of movement, sanitation, and control that still dictate our lives.